Hi, this is Simon from Tokyo Productions, and welcome back to part 2 of this tutorial in which we're looking at building this fire scene. So the first thing I'd like to do is to create some smoke, and to do that I'd like to come back to our fire particles build project, and let's save this as smoke particles build. And we just need to change a few things up to get it to look like smoke. First of all, I'm going to delete this ramp behavior here. Then I'm going to come into my clouds here, come over to the inspector, and I'm going to switch over the method to normal. Let's do that for all three of these. Then I just want to adjust their color down a bit. So select that color, just bring it down, just so it's a little bit more gray. Just do that on all three very quickly. Skip through and do all those. Then I'm going to go through and adjust the speeds. So I'm going to have speed of 1 for this first one here, and let's go for 1.2 for the next one, and 1.4 for the third one. And we've now got something like that. Then I'd like to come to the bump map filter here. I want to switch the controls to direction and amount. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a behavior to that direction. So right click, add parameter behavior, oscillate. And I'm going to set the amplitude to 360 so it revolves all the way around, and I'm going to set the speed to 5. And let's see how that looks. And you see we've got something a little bit gentler, softer, more smoke-like, I think. Obviously our loop still works because of how we set up our clone object there, if you remember. So we can now just go ahead and save this out. So come up to the share menu, export movie, and proxy will do. Going to go to my particles folder and just save this out as smoke particles. So now that we've done that, let's come back over to our main fire build project, and let's navigate to our particles folder, and let's bring in that smoke particles that we've just created into that particles group. Then what I'd like to do is I'd like to take my main fire group and duplicate it. So right click, duplicate, and let's call this smoke. Let's turn off the other two groups for the time being and open up this smoke group. I'd like to delete all of these emitters apart from the first one, and let's open that up. And let's drag the smoke particles into that particle source there. So now we've got our new softer smoke particles in there, you can probably see. And they look a little bit like this, but for the time being they're obviously fire coloured, so we need to come back over to the particle cell. Let's delete this colour tab here, let's select this one here. And let's initially make it white, and then I want to make it fairly dark grey, somewhere down around there, 0.25, something like that. Then I want to take this opacity tab and move that to 75%. And that looks something like this. Let's set the birth rate down to 0, and then I want to keyframe the birth rate randomness. So I'm going to come to roughly 2 seconds, doesn't really matter. And I'm going to hit a keyframe for the birth rate randomness. I'm going to come to the first frame and set that down to roughly 25, something like that. And so then they will just start to appear more gently than if we hadn't keyframed that. I also want to increase the life to 1.75 because smoke is going to linger longer than the actual fire. So let's see how that plays. And you can start to get a feel for that. Just going to turn off that particles group so we don't see that there. And I just like to come over here and set the angle randomness to 360 just to maximize the smokiness of it. And I think that's not looking too bad. We might just do is also add a little bit of scale randomness. Let's go for 25 on the scale randomness. And one other thing I need to do is to come over to properties for the emitter and set the blend mode to screen, just so it's not burning out quite so much. Now down here I've brought in the bright plate, which is an element that you'll find in the download link. Now very cleverly Sebastian shot both the dark action plate and this plate here, which I've taken to Photoshop and done a little bit of work on, but essentially it's a much brighter exposure. And what we can do is simply use a Bezier mask like that to give us a feel that the fire is lighting up the front of the building. And it's also going to be useful for creating a matte for the windows. So anyway, there you go, I've brought that in. I've just drawn a simple Bezier mask there with a large feather around it, just to get us started like that. So it's easier to see how this composite is working. So now we want to make sure we've got our show overlays turned on, our emitter selected, and our adjust item tool selected. And I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key and just drag this over to the next window as a way of making a duplicate. Again, hold down the Alt or Option key, drag it over to the third window here. Again, holding down the Alt or Option key, drag it up to the top window. So we've got a copy in each of the windows. And then we just need to come down right to the bottom here, click the random seed a few times for each instance. Come down to the bottom, random seed, click it a random number of times, and each of those is going to be different. So let's now turn back on our fire static and fire main and just see how this is playing. What we could do is we could come to the attractors for the smoke and just make some changes here. Maybe increase the strength on both of them. So I've gone for 120 for the top one and 80 for the second one. And if we do a grand preview of that, that's looking a little bit better. Obviously we need to remember to adjust the timing of this one on the right here, and again just grab it on the mini timeline. You probably remember that the timing was 1 second and 12 frames, so that only starts once that fire has exploded through that window. So before we get into the serious business of compositing all of this together, I'd like to render out the different elements. So let's close up a few of these groups. I'm going to turn off this background group, the entire background, so we're just on black, and let's isolate fire main, so that's all we're seeing. Come to share, export movie, we can go for 422, and I want to come to a folder called rendered elements, and let's call this fire main, render that out. Again, isolate fire static, come to the share menu, export movie, and again call this fire static, render that out. Finally, let's isolate smoke, again share menu, export movie, next call it smoke, render that out. So now we can come back over to our file browser. Let's look for that rendered elements folder, grab all three of those, and let's drag them into a new group at the top there. And we need to make sure this group is 2D, not 3D, bearing in mind that because we've got a camera, that automatically makes a 3D group, but we don't want that in this case. Okay, so let's first of all set the blend modes here. Fire main is going to go at the top, and we're going to set its blend mode to linear dodge. Static, again, let's set that to screen, and smoke, let's set that to screen. And let's switch back on our background action. And the advantage of this is we now no longer have to worry about generating those particles as we go through. You need to turn off that original smoke particles group, and that's just going to make the project more manageable and quicker to work with. Now I'd like to come to my fire main, and I'm going to duplicate that, and then I'm going to turn it off, and I'm going to call it fire displace. And then I'm going to come back to my fire main. I'm going to come over to the library and I'm going to look for filters, distortion, and let's grab bump map and add it to the fire main. Let's come to the inspector. Let's set the controls to horizontal and vertical scale, and let's set the horizontal scale to 0, and let's grab our fire displace and drag it into the map image source well, and just want to adjust this vertical scale. I think I'm going to go for something like -0.15, and let's just hide the smoke and static just so we can get a feel for how this is working. If I turn that on and off, you can see that's now displacing that fire. And I think that gives it a much more fire-like look. Because we're using the fire to displace itself, it's really quite cool. I think I might increase that value. Let's go for -0.2. And to me that's really starting to look much more fire-like, and I really quite like that. Let's turn back on static, and that's really looking quite nice. So this bright plate is looking a bit too bright and is not going to help with our composite. So let's come over to filters, color correction, and grab hue saturation and add that. Then we'll come over to the inspector. Let's just reduce the value down till we've got something like that, 0.6. And that's just going to help with compositing of our fire, I think. Let's also come to the fire, and while we're at it, grab that same hue saturation filter and add that. And let's just nudge down the saturation. Not very much. That's -0.15 there. And you can see that just helps to push it through a little bit more. Let's also add it to fire static. Again, come over to the inspector and let's nudge down the saturation. What you can do is click on that number field and use the up and down arrows to adjust that. And that's quite a handy way of controlling it. So there, I've nudged it down to -0.4, and I think you can see that that's really helped with the look there. Now I've done that to that static layer. Next, what I'd like to do is to take static and duplicate it. So right click, duplicate, and I'm going to come over to the library and I'm going to look for filters, blur, and I'm going to add Gaussian blur to that static. Come over to the inspector and let's set the amount to 150. And now you can probably see what that's done. That's created a nice glow there. So let's call that fire static glow inner. And let's right click, duplicate to have another copy of it. Come over to the filters. Let's set that Gaussian blur amount to 400. So that's really much wider. And let's undo that hue saturation so we've got a much warmer look. And I think you can see that those glows have really added to the realism of it. Obviously we need to keep balancing these elements in relation to each other so they don't start overpowering one another. What I'm also going to do is take fire static and again duplicate it, so that's the one at the bottom there. And I'm going to come to properties, and I'm just going to come down to the timing here and set the speed to 75. And I'll also set the frame blending to blending. And what that's just going to do is give me a little bit more complexity there. Now let's try turning back on our smoke. And that's all looking a bit too bright as well. So let's again come to the library, color correction, and this time let's look for levels, I think. And let's just grab this whiteout value here and just bring that down till that smoke starts to sit in a bit better. Come down quite a lot really, something like that. And that's starting to look okay, I think. But one of the reasons this isn't really looking plausible is that there isn't actually any fire behind the windows. I mean, obviously we want it in some of these other windows as well, but if you look here along the bottoms of these windows, we want to see fire behind it as well as in front of it, otherwise it just looks stuck on. So in order to do that, we're going to have to create a matte for the windows. So I'm going to come down to my useful bright plate here, and I'm going to duplicate it. So right click, duplicate, and then I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key and click on its tick box there to solo it. And I'm going to remove that Bezier mask and the hue saturation filter. Then I'm going to come over to the library, look for filters, keying, and I'm going to grab the Luma keyer and add that to the bright plate there. And I'll come over to the inspector. Just want to click on the middle view button there so we get the black and white output. And then I'm going to grab this black and crunch it down until we start to lose most of everything apart from the windows. And again, grab the white here and push it up till the windows are fairly bright and white. Something like that will do. I'm just going to unsolar this element for the time being, so Alt click the checkbox there, and then I'm going to group this element, so right click, group. I'm going to call the group window matte, and what we need to do is we need to paint in black into all the areas that we don't want, so for example the sky and all this stuff over on the right here. So in order to paint in black, we're going to come down to the Bezier tool here. Then we're going to come up to Window Show HUD. We're going to make sure the fill color is black. So we're just going to start at the top here, click there, come across here. I want to include this little window here, so let's click there and there. Let's keep this in here, come down to there, just the bottom of this ledge. We'll come across to the bottom of this left-hand window. We'll click up there, and to hold down the space bar so I can pan across without dropping the tool, and then come across to there, down here, again hold down the space bar so I can pan across, come over to here, up to here, and click here to close up the shape, and Shift Z to reset the view. And there you go, we've got our matte nicely tidied up. Okay, so first of all let's turn off this group at the top here, which is our fire composite group. Turn that off, and let's also turn off window matte, but let's drag it out into its own space there. That's not in our background group, and let's call this group background. Okay, so what we now need to do is we need to make a new group above this window matte. So select that, object, new group, and we're going to make this 2D, not 3D. Just going to open up our fire composite group, and I'm going to grab fire static there, and holding down the Alt or Option key, I'm going to drag that into my new group here. Sorry if this is getting a bit confusing. And let's just call this window fire. Close up fire composite, and I'm going to right click on that window fire group, add image mask, and I'm going to take my window matte there and drag it into the mask source, and I'm going to set the source channel to luminance because we've got just a black and white matte like that. What I also need to do though is I need to set this window fire group to linear dodge, and then you'll see how that works. Looks like that, and I think if I turn that on and off, you can see how suddenly much more effective that is. We've got fire behind the windows, and that looks pretty cool. I'm going to just take this fire, and I think I'm going to slow it down to 85%, just so it's not quite so busy. I think I like that better. Now what I need to do is I also need to make sure that this fills in all the other windows. Obviously we could go off and make some specific fire for this, but I think I'm just going to cheat and just duplicate this layer. I'm going to make sure my overlays are turned on, and then I can just move it across like that till it's filling that window. Let's do something like that. We'll need to duplicate it again so we can fill in the window at the top there. Let's duplicate it again. We want to look at filling in some of these bottom windows here. Maybe like that. And I'm going to duplicate it again. Move it across. Something like that. Maybe duplicate it one more time. There's no harm in having lots of this in there. Let's have a quick look at that. We need to RAM preview it. This one on the right here probably needs filling in with a bit more fire, so I'm going to duplicate one more time, come back to the head there. You'll notice of course that we have that element that starts a little bit late, so let's move this one over like this. If we turn on our fire composite, the whole thing looks much more effective, I think, now that we've got that extra fire behind the windows. What I'd like to do though is I'd like to get a little bit of a sense of the fire glowing out from within these windows rather than that it's just neatly cut off by that mat. And there's a very easy way of doing that. If we select the window mat, come to the library, come to filters, blur, we can grab Gaussian blur, add that to that window mat group, come to the inspector, and then as we adjust that blur amount value, you can see it starts to look much more like it's glowing out. So amount of about 15 looks better, I think. So let's close this window fire group down, close down that mat and the background. Let's make some more particles. I'd like to make some particles that look like glass shattering as this right-hand window explodes outwards. So to do that, I'm going to open up my fire main group again. I'm going to turn on my overlays just so I can see what's happening here. Just want to go through and find that right-hand window. It's that one there. And I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key and I'm going to drag it out right to the top of the project there. That'll make a new group. I'm going to call this group Shards. And let's hold down the Alt or Option key and click on that checkbox to solo that layer. Let's now come to the emitter. I want to come over to the library. I want to look for content and then particle images. I'm going to come down here to the search and type in dust. I'm going to grab dust 04 and bring it into a new group, so drag it right up to the top of the project there, turn that group to 2D. Then I'm going to take the dust particle there and drag it into the particle cell for my shards emitter, and we've now got that dust particle instead. I'm going to select the emitter and I'm going to come over to the inspector. First of all, let's adjust the birth rate. So I'm going to come to 112 here. I'm going to click on the keyframe button there and I'm going to set the birth rate to 750. And I'm going to step forward a couple of frames, 1, 2, and set the birth rate down to 0. I want to set the initial number down to 0. I want to turn the birth rate randomness down to 0. Probably see that's just giving me a burst of particles like that. Okay, the life I'm going to set to 2.5 and the life randomness I'm going to set to 2. The speed I'm going to set to 200 and the speed randomness to 50. I'm going to set the angle randomness to 720 and the spin to 360 and the spin randomness to 60. Okay, let's come down to the scale and let's set the scale to 50 and the scale randomness also to 50. Now let's have a look at the color. I want to select this first color tab here and let's just brighten it up. Let's pull that in towards white here. Go for something like that. Then I want to hold down the Alt or Option key and drag this color till it's just after that orange one there. And then I want to grab the orange one and Alt drag it to the end there again to make a copy of it. So we've now got a repetition of those colors there. Let's close down the color pane. I'm going to remove this initial opacity tab here. Let's move the position of this one to 5%. I'm going to come over here and delete the scale over life. And I come to the top of the emitter here and I'm just going to adjust the direction. So I'm going to set the emission angle down to 0 because I don't want them to fly upwards. I want them to fly out on the Z axis. So that means having an emission range of 90. So now they look something like that. So So what we need to do is we need to add some gravity. So I'm going to come over to the library, come over to behaviors, clear that search result there, simulations, gravity, and add that to the emitter. Come to the inspector and let's set the acceleration to 100. So they fall down. So turning off the overlays, that looks like that. So what's nice about what we did with the emitter here in having this color variance in the gradient is it looks as though the particles are catching the light as they spin, and that's quite a nice effect, I think. Okay, so now we can turn everything back on again, or rather we can unsolo this layer by alt-clicking that group there. I need to turn off that group that contains the dust particle there, and everything together looks like that. Let's have a quick RAM preview. So this is looking like this. What we also need to do is we need to create some nice swirling sparks. So let's have a go at that. To do that, I'm going to make a new project. So new project, remember to make it 25 frames a second, 1920, 1080, 10 seconds long. And I'm just going to grab the background, clip 14, Command C to copy, come to my new project here, paste that in, just so we've got a reference, zoom out. Let's come back over to the library. Again, let's look for content and particle images. Again, let's type down here this dust. And I want to grab dust 05 and bring it into a new group. Looks like that. Can turn that group off. And then select that dust and hit E to make an emitter. I'm going to drag that out into a new group. I'm going to come over to the inspector. The shape I'm going to set to rectangle, and the arrangement I'm going to set to random fill. I'm going to open up the size, and let's have a width of 1200, leave the height at 300. Let's come down to the birth rate randomness and set that to 30. Let's set the life to 2. And let's come down to the color here. Let's choose over life for the color mode. Let's close up that emitter controls group just to give ourselves a bit more space here. Open up the gradient. Might as well click on additive blend there while we're at it. I'm going to set an opacity tab here on the top by clicking on that top bar. Another one here, which I'll move all the way over to the right. This one, the location, we'll set to 20%. First one, we'll set the opacity down to 0. Last one, opacity down to 0, so they fade in and out. This left-hand color, I'm going to go for something like that. And the right-hand color, let's drag that away, hold down the Alt or Option key, drag that along. Let's just make this more red. Finally, let's come down to the scale and set that value to 5 and the scale randomness to 4, because obviously we want these to be very, very small. Come to the emitter transform. Let's adjust the rotation, so open that up. I'm going to set a Y rotation of 30 degrees, and I want to move it to -240 on X and 220 on Y. So those particles are up there around where those windows are. If we turn on the adjust item tool and turn on our overlays, you can get a feel for where they're being generated, roughly like that. What we could also do is just introduce some Z rotation, maybe like that. Not too critical because we're going to be flying these particles around. So that's -10 on Z. So as we did with the fire, we want to have these particles to swirl around. And you'll probably remember that we did that by creating a dummy object. So let's come to the top here, Object, New Group, and let's come down to the rectangle tool. Let's draw a random rectangle like that. I'm just going to make it this color so we can see it. Come to its properties and hit the very useful reset button there to center it up. So then I'm going to click on the XY position, right click, add parameter behavior, wriggle. I'm going to set the wriggle amount to 480. I'm going to have the apply mode add and subtract. I'm going to reduce the frequency down to 0.4, and I'm going to reduce the noisiness down to 0.25. Then I'm also going to add an oscillate behavior. So I'm going to again right click on the position, add parameter behavior, oscillate. We're going to set the amplitude to 720 and the speed will increase to 20. See how that plays. You can see we've got this thing flying around fairly randomly. Okay, so again we're going to use some forces on the emitter. First of all, select the emitter, come to the library, come up to behaviors. Let's clear that search result so we see everything. Let's come down to simulations. So I want to select random motion, I want to select gravity, and I want to select attracted to. And I can select all of those by holding down the command key to make a multiple selection. Then I'm going to drag those onto the emitter. And let's come over to the inspector. For the random motion, I'm going to increase the noisiness to 1. The attracted to, I'm going to set the strength to 40. And for the gravity, I'm going to increase that to 40. And obviously the key thing we need to do is to take our rectangle and drag it into the object source well for the attracted to. And then we can turn off this group here with the dummy object in it. And now if you press play, you can see how those particles are being dragged around by the force there. They look pretty nice, I think. Okay, so let's just turn off the action group there. Let's come to the share menu, export movie. We can make do with proxy. Come to our particles folder and we'll save this out as sparks. And so back in our main project, we can come to the file browser, look for particles, find the sparks render, bring that in to the top of the project, set this group to 2D, come over to the inspector, let's set the blend mode to screen, or maybe even linear dodge to give them a little bit more brightness. And then if we have a look at that, you can see the sparks flying around. I think what I want to do is come to roughly 3 seconds on the timeline and select the sparks, set a keyframe for the opacity there, come back to the first frame, let's set that down to 0. In actual fact, maybe we can set our keyframe at 112 for the opacity down to 0, so they don't actually appear until after that window is smashed. And I think that's going to be better. So here's the entire sequence. And I think that's probably enough for part 2. I had hoped to show you the complete composite within this part, but obviously there's a whole lot more compositing that we actually need to do. So I think we'll save that all for part 3. And I very much hope you can join me for that one, because I think it's going to be pretty interesting. So thanks very much indeed for watching this far, and I hope to see you again shortly.